Hello guys and welcome back. In this video I'm going to talk about Bloodborne story explained with some of gameplay. I know it's been 6 years since the game has been released, but the game is still great until this day. So let's get into this, enjoy watching. Bloodborne is an action role-playing game developed by FromSoftware and published by Sony Computer Entertainment, which released for PlayStation 4 in March 2015. Bloodborne follows the player character, a hunter, through the decrepit Gothic Victorian era inspired by of Yharnam, whose inhabitants are afflicted with the blood-borne disease, attempting to find the source of the plague. The player's characters unravel the city's mysteries while fighting beasts and cosmic beings. The game is played from the third-person perspective. Players controls a customizable protagonist, and gameplay is focused on strategic weapons based on combat and exploration. Players battle feared enemies while using a team such as swords and firearms, exploring different locations, interacting with non-player character, and unraveling the city's mysteries. Bloodborne began development in 2012 under the working title of Project Beast, bearing many similarities to the Souls series of game by the same developer and director. Bloodborne was inspired by literary works of author H.P. Lovecraft and Bram Stoker, as well as the architectural design of real-world locations in places such as Romania and Czech Republic. The game decision by game director Hidetaka Miyazaki to create a new intellectual property IP and not another Souls game was made because he wanted to create something different. At the same time, Sony wanted a new IP to be made exclusively for PlayStation 4. The game features elements similar to those found in the Souls series of games, practically Demon Souls and Dark Souls. The player makes their way through different locations within the decrepit Gothic world of Yharnam, while battling feared enemies, including bosses, collecting different types of teams that have many uses, interacting with a strange non-player character, opening up shortcuts, and continuing through the main story. At the beginning of the game, the player creates their character. The hunter, the player determines the basic details of a hunter: gender, hairstyle, name, skin color, body shape, voice, and eye color are some of the options the player can customize. The player also chooses a starting classes known as an origin, which provides a basic backstory for the hunter and sets the player's starting attributes. The origins allow the player hunter to have a distinct play style, which along with the physical appearance give the hunter unique personality. For example, one origin may describe the hunter as cowardly weakling, which would indicate the player prefers to avoid conflict, while another origin may describe the hunter as being ruthless killing machine, which would indicate that the hunter prefers to engage in the combat. Another way to the player defends their hunter is by choosing what brotherhood they are a member of. These religious societies known as governance each have their own views on the world of Yharnam. The player can return to the safe zone known as the hunter's dream by interacting with the lanterns spread throughout the world of Yharnam. Doing so refreshes health by abilities all enemies in the game world. Lanterns also serve as the game's checkpoints. The player will return to the last activate lantern when they die. Positioned away from Yharnam, the hunter's dream delivers some of the game's basic features to the player. Players may purchase useful items such as clothing from the messengers using blood echoes or insight, level up their character by talking to the doll, or upgrade their weapon in the workshop, among another thing. Unlike Yharnam and all other locations in the game, the hunter's dream is considered completely safe as it is the only location in the game not future enemies. Bloodborne's world of Yharnam is a large map full of interconnected areas. Some of areas of Yharnam are not connected to the main locations and require the player to teleport there via gravestone. In the hunter's dream, the player may be presented with the multiplayer options when processing through locations, but usually there is a main path that the player uses to progress through the story. When traversing the main path, the player will encounter paths that lead to completely different locations that are optional. Each path also eventually leads back to the central area that the player started in. This provides the player with the shortcuts useful for when they die or need to backtrack. Combat is a fast-paced and requires an offensive approach in order for the player to combat dense hordes of enemies. The player character is agile and is able to dodge attacks by strafing around enemies while locked on. The new risk and reward style of gameplay is emphasized through Bloodborne's Rally system, which allows the player to recover portions of lost health by striking an enemy within a small window of time. The director Hidetaka Miyazaki explained that is the representative of a player's increased will to continue after successfully striking an enemy. A new game plus mode is also present after the player has finished the game. A new game will immediately be started. A new game plus is optional. The player returns all their equipment and their game is harder than the previous playthrough. The player may only wield 2 melee weapons and 2 secondary weapons at one time. Most melee weapons, called the track weapons, can transform into an alternate state. Each state encourages a different approach to combat. For example, the Hunter Axe in its initial state is wielded with one-handed and can be used to quickly dispatch enemies in cramped areas, but when transformed into a secondary state, it becomes an extended two-handed weapon more suited for crowd control. With the most track weapons, one state is usually slower, bigger weapon that deals heavier damage per hit, while the other state is smaller and faster and deals it damage in hit strikes. The player's main secondary weapon is a firearm. The firearm, usually a pistol, can be used in a tradition sense as well as a way to stun enemies. When the enemy is stunned, the player can perform a visceral attack. Visceral attacks cause a large amount of damage in one hit and can also be performed after a charge attack. Other secondary weapons include a torch, a cannon, and a wooden shield, while other main melee weapons includes a hammer, a sword, a two-handgun, which serves as the melee and ranged weapons, and whip. The player can carry other offensive weapons such as a Molotov, throwing knives. Similarly to the previous Souls game, slaying enemies grants the player blood echoes, which doubles as the player's experience points, and the game currency should the player die. Their blood echoes will be lost at the location of their death. If they are able to reach the point again, they can regain them. However, should the player die before they can retrieve their lost blood echoes, they will be lost forever. Sometimes the player's blood echoes may be captured by an enemy, typically identified by glowing blue eyes. Defeating this enemy will return to the lost blood echoes. If an enemy does not hold the blood echoes, they will be on the ground near the location of the player's death. Insight is a secondary form of currency. They can be spent to purchase a team, and depending on the player's insight level, the world will change in many different ways. When the player reaches a specific insight level, some NPCs or enemies might no longer be presented. The sky and moon may change color. The player may start hearing different sounds, such as crying baby and mysterious whisperings, or enemies' attack patterns may change. The world also changes as the player progresses through the main story. Insight can be gained by finding and defeating bosses using teams that grant insight, helping another player via cooperate defeat bosses, and by successfully defeating another player in the competitive multiplayer. When enemies are defeated, they drop useful items for the player, such as blood vials, which are used as healing poisons or quicksilver bullets. The main ammunition for ranged weaponry. The player can also sacrifice health to create blood bullets for their ranged weaponry. Blood bullets cause a slightly more damage than standard quicksilver bullets, and the rally system still applies to the lost health. The player may find useful items hidden in the environment, as well as being dropped by enemies. The items hidden in the environment usually require the player to go on a different path than the path they were intently traveling. Other items the player may find include various forms of cold blood, which grant the player blood echoes when consumed, used to cure poisoning, and hunter badges, items that allows the player to purchase more items in the hunter's dream. The player's weapons can also be upgraded or modified by equipping creation items. Multiplayer mode is presented in a Bloodborne as well, though it functions differently from counterparts in the Soul series by activating a non-consumable item at the cost of one insight point. Players can summon other players into their world to help with the boss battles or large groups of enemies and progress through areas of the game cooperatively. This leaves players vulnerable to invasions in which another player may invade the victim's game world and attempt to kill them, unless the player can find and defeat specific enemies known as a chime maiden before an enemy player's invites. Multiplayer summons are limited by proximity. Players can only be summoned within a specific distance of each other to prevent players being summoned too far away to be of any assistance. Players can only summon other players that are around the same level as them to prevent the game from being too difficult or too easy from one of other players. Using a password, however, gets around many of the restriction of summoning a friend depending on what covenant the player and summoned player are part of. They will have the opportunity to be the hostile towards one another. Players can summon an NPC, help them in addition to getting help from the other players. The NPC service is an all companion to the player that helps defeated enemies. Players can only summon specific NPCs that they have met throughout their journey. Another way the players may interact with each other is by leaving notes. A player may leave a tip for defeating a boss, tell the reader where to go, fool the reader by previously providing incorrect information, or just leaving meaningless message to the others. Players may rate a message as fine or foul, which will indicate to future readers whether the note is useful or untrustworthy. Chalice dungeons are randomly generated dungeons that vary in depth and difficulty and can be reformed by performing a ritual with Chalice and other creations materials in the hunter's dreams. Chalice dungeons are optional and provide additional content to the player, and the dungeon's gameplay is much the same as the main story in that contains various areas and enemies that the player must overcome to complete the dungeon. And each Chalice dungeon contains a multiple bosses that the player must defeat to progress through the dungeon's level. Special types of lootable chests that are not found in the main story are hidden throughout the dungeons, providing the player with the materials or generate more dungeons. Chalice dungeons are only indoors, cramped, and contain main trails of typical dungeon. The branching paths featured in the main story are still present in the Chalice dungeon. Another important difference are the objectives in the main story. Player's journey through the main different locations with many different objectives. And that was it for this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button down below. I would really appreciate it. Thank you all for watching and thank you for your support, and I'll see you next time. Bye.